We're here at Rock Island Auction today in our preview hall that is set up for the upcoming 2023 August premiere auction. And among the very many collectible and historical firearms that are set up in the hall currently, there are a couple of water-cooled heavy machine guns from a bygone era that I would like to show you. And the first two are directly to my left, which are a Vickers Mark I heavy machine gun and a Group Industries M37 set up like a Colt Browning M1917 from the United States. Now, in the 1800s, going into the late 1800s, there were a few repeating machine gun style weapons out in the world, like the Gatling gun. However, they were not very reliable, and they typically required the input from the user to actually cause them to be cyclic in their repeating fire. Now, it wasn't until Hiram Maxim developed his own Maxim gun in the late 1800s that suddenly a repeating firearm could be adapted into a reliable and self-sustained package. Now, Hiram Maxim was an American, but in very classic at the time American stature, the U.S. Ordnance Department simply was not interested in researching and further developing some of the great arms that were being developed, including that which was developed by Hiram Maxim. However, many other nations, including the colonial powers of Europe, were very interested, and they all put their hands into the honeypot looking to try to further develop this weapon. And the British were some of the biggest workers on this, and the Vickers is ultimately the result of all that work that the British put into developing that design. And throughout World War I, the Vickers became one of the mainstays of the British military in trench warfare, being used from everything of holding back German attacks to even being used as impromptu artillery with plunging fire, where rounds could be lobbed several thousand yards downrange into enemy trenches. Now, one of the most distinctive features of the water-cooled machine gun is the water jacket. But why do you have a water jacket? At the time, when they had actually finally had a mechanism of fire that could reach up to 600 rounds per minute and sustain itself, which the Vickers could, there was still a very big problem. And that was, what do you do when the barrel gets too hot? And with the metallurgy of the time, it just simply was not very feasible to create an air-cooled system that could shoot for thousands of rounds without needing a barrel change. And so, they came up with the idea of placing a jacket of water around the barrel, which would cool the barrel, and as the water heated, it could siphon out through the top into a tube, go down into a collecting tank, and then from that collecting tank, water could be siphoned back up and into the cooling jacket to repeat the cycle. And with that, you had a weapon system that could sustain fire for not hundreds of rounds, but tens of thousands of rounds if it was crewed and maintained properly. This specific Vickers Mark I is made by VSM, and it has some of the more well-known features of the design, including the booster at the very front of the water jacket, which was an addition done by Vickers to help the recoil action of the gun itself. And what it does is it simply enhances some of the forces being exerted by the escaping gas at the muzzle and uses that to boost the action for a more reliable cycle. The other thing that you'll notice is the corrugated steel water jacket. Now, through the Vickers development, they initially started with a very thick water jacket to help with rigidity, but at the same time, when they were trying to reduce weight, they saw that as one of the features that they needed to work on. However, there was a problem. If they made the water jacket too thin, it could become too brittle. And so, they developed this distinctive corrugated steel water jacket in an attempt to reduce the weight while still maintaining a little bit of the rigidity. And it's interesting to note that there are different versions. There's a smooth version and there's this corrugated version that you can see on the Vickers Mark I, which we do have some other Vickers in this auction that have the other type. And moving on to the next gun, which is a M37 with a receiver made by Group Industries, it is set up to resemble a Colt Browning Model 1917 machine gun. And going back to the United States had a wide resource of different firearms inventors, and many early successful machine guns designs, including The Maxim and the Lewis, which were developed in the US, but US ordnance overturned, thinking that it wasn't important for what they wanted. When the United States ended up entering World War I in 1917, however, they ended up finding themselves in a situation where they needed a machine gun, and they needed a machine gun fast. But luckily, John Moses Browning happened to have a design sitting around that he had worked on in 1900, and that ultimately became the Browning Model 1917 machine gun. And what's interesting about it is that it also uses a recoil operation system. However, it does not use a toggle lock system like the Maxim that essentially every other machine gun that was in wide adoption at the time used. And the design was so successful that after World War I, it was later developed into the 1919, which was an air-cooled version, and the water-cooled version, the 1917, continued service all the way up into Vietnam, and even with other countries past that. Another interesting thing to note on this M37, though, is actually the tripod that it's sitting on. Now, unlike the standard model 1917 or the 1917A1 tripod, which most people are familiar with, the 1918 tripod was a simplified version that was developed in 1918 in hopes that they could produce more than the standard 1917, which was more intricate and took more time to produce. However, in the interwar period, that they found the 1918 mechanism simply didn't work as well as they wanted. So they were eventually phased out of service, which makes this tripod fairly unique to see. Some other interesting facts about the M37 include the fact that while it is set up to look like a 1917, because of parts interchangeability with the receiver design, it could also be set up to look like a 1919. With its current configuration, it has a flash hider on the front, which is something that the original 1917 and World War I would not have. Another interesting feature is the addition of an extra carry handle adapter on the water jacket, and that's to help try to add some maneuverability to what is otherwise a very heavy and unwieldy gun. And as a matter of fact, during World War II, when it came to 1917 crews, it wasn't uncommon for the crews to wrap a towel or some sort of cloth around the water jacket and have the gunner run around with the gun up in his arm, still able to fire it if he had to. The water-cooled 1917 might not be as well known when it comes to World War II as the air-cooled 1919A4. However, it was the 1917 that's also associated with some of the most well-known and storied instances during World War II with the American Marine Corps, one of which is that of John Basilone on Guadalcanal, which during that battle, he picked up one of these water-cooled machine guns, and while fending off Japanese attackers, ended up burning himself from the sheer amount of fire and from the heat of the water jacket as he moved around and tried to suppress the Japanese onslaught. When I said the Maxim gun was used by pretty much everyone in Europe, I wasn't kidding. And this Maxim Model 1910 sitting right next to me from Russia is actually a very good illustration of that. It has a German Spandau 1908 side plate, yet the Russian 1910 and the German 1908 Maxim are so closely related in design that the parts can be used together. The 1910 is actually probably one of the more interesting guns in the Maxim story, though. And it's partially because of this wheeled mount that you see with the shield, which is very iconic unto itself, but also because of this little cap on top of the water jacket. And this is nicknamed the tractor cap. And essentially what this allows this operator of the 1910 to do is, say the water was frozen in the water pipes, or they didn't have any other means to get water into the water jacket. You could open the top here and put ice or snow into the water jacket through the top, and thus still have a means to cool the barrel. Now, these were eventually phased out during the Cold War era, and actually during World War II as well with the SG-43, but despite that, the Maxim 1910 has continued to pop up the world over in conflicts, including the current conflict in Ukraine, where these are still being used today by both sides. What's truly unique about this Russian Maxim that I'm sitting directly next to, though, is the fact that it uses a Spandau MG 1908 side plate, has a 1944 Tula Arsenal parts kit, and doesn't come with just one mount, but another one complete in the box, as well as a Finnish ski mount that has a little stock in the back that ideally would be used in the snow. It's not every day that someone gets a chance to sit next to a historical water-cooled machine gun such as this Maxim 1910 next to me, but it's even less common for someone to get a chance to own one, which you could get the chance to do if you bid in our upcoming August 2023 premiere auction at Rock Island Auction Company.